Greetings and salutations, everyone. Today we'll be taking a look at the classical Roman civilization. From a small city-state to one of the largest empires in history, that's what we're going to be taking a look at today. I understand this is a ton of information, so let's get started. When you look at Italy itself, it's probably one of the best recognizable countries in the world just because of the iconic boot-shaped peninsula that sticks all the way into the middle of the Mediterranean. And this location is really going to facilitate a lot of trade among Africa, the Mediterranean, even Eastern Asia, or the Eastern Mediterranean, Western Asia, Asia Minor. And the mountains to the north are going to provide quasi-isolation from neighboring entities. The climate's good, the soil's good rich resources throughout. It's really a great place if you wanted to set up a mid-region civilization. Now there's two stories on how Rome itself came to be. The first is these magical twins who were raised by a magical wolf, but that is a good fairy tale to tell. The more plausible one is 7 different villages on 7 adjoining hills that just kind of grew together until they were united around 620 BCE. And in its first iteration, the city-state/village of Rome was ruled by a group of kings, tyrant kings, autocratic kings, the Tarquinian family, and they united Rome. They established how to build houses out of bricks, they laid out city streets, created an idea of the forum, the role of the city government, and in this regard they were really good rulers. But over time they became less good rulers because the people were upset that, well, the Tarquinians, like all autocratic rulers, started to use their power for less good for the people, more good for the republic. Come here. Sorry, Waffles just walked into the room and I want to make sure he's off the bookshelf. In 509, when this happens, the Romans establish a republic. And a republic is a type of government where you elect individuals to make the big decisions for you. It's in the family of being a democracy. However, it is faster. While the democracy, especially the Athenian model of democracy, did get everybody involved, it was glacial slow. While the republic was able to function at least a little quicker, even though it was not a total pooling of everyone. The two main social groups that we would see come into existence in the Republic would be the patricians. These are your wealthy haves, your top 1%ers, your senators, your owners of Latiunda, the very large plantation-like farms, and aristocrats. And then you've plebeians, the everybody else. It's really worth pointing out that being a plebeian didn't mean you were poor, it just meant that you were not super duper rich. They had some rights, but they really couldn't hold public office, and the ability of things they could do was greatly hindered, and everybody, including them, knew that fact. Politically, though, Rome's government is going to be very similar to our own American Democratic Republic. There's 3 branches of government, the legislative being held up by the Senate and the senators, and these are the guys who made the laws. The big difference between these 2 branches is that the legislative branch also directly elected the head of the executive branch, and this definitely created some nepotism, some cronyism, some favoritism, where the Senate and the head of the executive branch became a who you know, who's your friend kind of thing. The head of Rome's executive branch were 2 guys. The title is called a consul. And the idea of them is one does all the local stuff, one does the international stuff. They are also only in office for a year. This is so that they don't do too much stuff. I mean, in a year, there's not a lot you can do, especially because there's 2 of them. Each consul can veto what the other one wants to do. So they have to work together. They have to be able to come together and get stuff done. Otherwise, nothing gets done for that entire year that they're in office. In the event that Rome finds itself in a position that the consuls can't help, there is the occasional position of a dictator, a leader who is the voice of the entire state. He has more authority than either consul and is able to rule directly. The idea is that the dictator would be in charge until the problem facing Rome was defeated, and then give the power back. And this seems like it would be a recipe for disaster, but really it worked pretty well, except for that one time that it didn't. Rome's laws are called the 12 Tables. They're called this because they were made on these giant bronze tablets. They were held in the Forum, and they had the basic idea of judiciary in Rome. The idea that everyone had a right to a trial, that you had the right to face your accusers, you were innocent until the state proved you were guilty. Again, these should sound familiar because they are tenets of the American judicial system. It's where we got these ideas from. Rome's religion, it's not exactly the most creative religion there is. It mirrored the Greeks in that it was the Greek religion with Roman names. There's nothing even remotely creative about it. So this is one of the reasons we don't really give a lot of credence to the Roman religion. It's just, if you want to see it, see what Greek did, they did it first, they did it better. The Roman family, as far as a social unit, really worked really well as an idea for the state throughout the empire until the collapse of Rome. The family was very large and also very close-knit. The person who headed the family was the eldest father, the pater familia. He was in charge of everything. He could make big business decisions for the family, arrange marriages if needed, and the family itself included more than just the immediacy of a family like we'd see in the West today. It included parents, it included the pater familia, all the way down to all the married kids, married sons, all their families, anyone who is dependent on the family. So if there's a grandfather or great aunt who can't take care of themselves, they were also considered part of the direct family. Slaves were even part of the family too. Roman women really didn't have a lot of rights. They had more rights than some Greeks, definitely way more than the Athenians, but not necessarily as much as the Spartans. But generally speaking, Roman women had more rights than Grecian women. As Rome started to expand, it faced the threat of its neighbors, and this is a threat that we see in all River Valley and even in a lot of classical civilizations. We saw this with Greece too, where there were a bunch of different city-states in the immediate region, or villages in the immediate region, and you had to worry that sooner or later there's going to be conflict. And as Rome starts growing and growing, it starts to make peace with these groups if it can, or conquer these groups if it can't. And this really is facilitated by the idea that Rome was offering great things to the people underneath it. Rome was a great unifier, a great group to the people who needed it to be. And for those that it was a great threat to, then you had to face the, which was pretty impressive. Rome had turned its army into legion groups. Each group was made up of 6,000 people. This allowed the Roman army to be deployed relatively quickly, relatively efficiently, and you could even break down a legion if you needed to so that it could work faster and quicker. The military tactics that the legion used look similar to hoplites, but the tactics are really very different. The ability to redeploy soldiers very quickly, very easily, while at the same time giving them rest, even on the battlefield, even during a battle, is one of the reasons that the Roman army was so useful and so successful. Rome's biggest first problem was, from political conquering perspective, was Carthage. This massive trading empire that had already existed in North Africa. And on this map you can see where the Carthaginian Empire extended to, and how Rome ultimately was going to have to find this was not good for them. When two large empires reach close together, either there's permanent peace or one of them will go to war. And greetings and salutations, everyone. Today we'll be taking a look at the classical Roman civilization. From a small city-state to one of the largest empires in history. That's what we're going to be taking a look at today. I understand this is a ton of information, so let's get started. The Second Punic War is the story of revenge, and it starts because of a Carthaginian general named Hannibal. He had this great hatred for Rome. His father had hated Rome. His father had died fighting Rome. So this is the revenge story where this great general marches from Carthage, which remember is in North Africa, to Italy. He goes the long way, across North Africa, Morocco, into Spain, across France, then down the Alps, into Italy itself, using elephants. A tactic and a tool that the Roman legionaries just had no idea what they were doing. And the sieges that the Carthaginian army was able to do were devastating. At one point, Hannibal's army was able to take on a Roman army that was a vastly superior number. The Roman army outnumbered Hannibal's army almost 2-1, and Hannibal was able to seize victory from this, and a very good victory as well. The Romans realized that directly attacking Hannibal was something that just was not going to be a thing they could do. So they attacked Carthage directly again. And when Hannibal realized that his home was the one being destroyed and it was about to be lost, he turned to head back and reinforce them. He had left with most of Carthage's army and knew that the city-state would not be able to defend itself. While he was on his way back, though, he was captured and killed in Spain. And again, Carthage loses, has to give Rome a giant indemnity. The Third Punic War is really not a war. I mean, a war is two sides that fight each other, and there's conflict. This was a conflict which happened 5 decades after Carthage was lost the Second Punic War, after Hannibal was dead for 50 years. And Rome forced this massive war against Carthage. When the Romans were victorious, which happened relatively quickly, Carthage was destroyed. It was burned to the ground. Every person who fought was killed. Every person who didn't fight was sold into slavery. And the Romans destroyed Carthage so badly, we're not even sure exactly where it is on a map anymore. And it was a major trading empire. So that's saying something. This was referred to as a Roman peace. The idea that this is the best thing you could hope for if you wanted to go to war with Rome. And everybody kind of knew that. Unfortunately, the problems that started to show up in Rome start to show up pretty obvious and pretty quick. You've got corruption in the government, which is, well, we talked about that with the characteristics of this republic anyways. The role of slaves in warfare, because Rome had conquered so many and had enslaved so much, it was usually cheaper to just work a slave to death than instead of giving them time off to rest or recuperate, especially if they hurt themselves. And the kind of impact that a growing empire has. Conquered people need to find some place in the empire, and sometimes that's not exactly easy to do. But distractions, some necessary. Giant aqueducts would bring fresh water into the city, so people never wanted for fresh water or pumping sewage out. Like chariot races, gladiator races, the Grand Colosseum kept people distracted from the reality of their problems. But these problems didn't just... The Third Punic War is really not a war. I mean, a war is two sides that fight each other, and there's conflict. This was a conflict which happened 5 decades after Carthage was lost the Second Punic War, after Hannibal was dead for 50 years. And Rome forced this massive war against Carthage. When the Romans were victorious, which happened relatively quickly, Carthage was destroyed. It was burned to the ground. Every person who fought was killed. Every person who didn't fight was sold into slavery. And the Romans destroyed Carthage so badly, we're not even sure exactly where it is on a map anymore. And it was a major trading empire. So that's saying something. This was referred to as a Roman peace. The idea that this is the best thing you could hope for if you wanted to go to war with Rome. And everybody kind of knew that. Unfortunately, the problems that started to show up in Rome start to show up pretty obvious and pretty quick. You've got corruption in the government, which is, well, we talked about that with the characteristics of this republic anyways. The role of slaves in warfare, because Rome had conquered so many and had enslaved so much, it was usually cheaper to just work a slave to death than instead of giving them time off to rest or recuperate, especially if they hurt themselves. And the kind of impact that a growing empire has. Conquered people need to find some place in the empire, and sometimes that's not exactly easy to do. Some solutions that did work was the army leaders themselves. You see, nowadays if you wanted to fight in the armed forces, you usually get something when you retire. But in Rome, if you fought in the legion or in the army, then when you are done and your time to serve is up, you walk away from the army with nothing. It wasn't until Marius do we see generals start asking their soldiers to swear loyalty to them, not the empire. And in exchange for this, the Roman generals would make sure that their soldiers would retire with something. This led to armies being more loyal to a general than they were to the entire country. Probably one of Rome's greatest generals and leaders was Gaius Julius Caesar. Now, he was a fantastic individual, patrician from birth, unique kind of birth, Caesarean birth. He would go on to be consul, governor, general. His attributes are really amazing. But he would ultimately become a member of the First Triumvirate, a 3-person group made up of him and Crassus and Pompey, who would collectively rule Rome. That is until Julius Caesar took control of Rome itself and became dictator for life. When he did this, it was a very surprising transition because Rome was moving in a new direction when Caesar came to power. He made every person in and around Italy directly a Roman citizen. You were given immediate, full patronage, loyalty, and skill, protection from the state. If you were unemployed, you were given a job. He created a new calendar and then named it after himself, the Julian calendar, the calendar system we use now. His death came about because he wanted to, fix the major problems in Rome. He was killed by the Roman senators, by people he knew, directly, in some cases very closely. He was stabbed 20 some odd times on the floor of the Roman Senate. And this is the event that we say marks the end of Rome being a republic. Because from this point on, it is going to tilt very quickly to becoming an empire. And it's going to also see the creation of the Second Triumvirate, led by Caesar's successor / adopted nephew, adopted son, Octavian, Mark Antony, and Marcus Lepidus, one of them a general, one of them a very, very, very wealthy man. And they created a second triumvirate, which was about as useful as the first triumvirate. Octavian would claim power after a civil war between himself and Mark Antony, and Octavian was convinced from this point on Rome was just too big for one person to rule. It was too big for it to be ruled by anyone other than one person. It was no longer a republic. It became an empire. And this was the first step in Rome's next chapter. Rome becoming an empire. He was absolute ruler. He starts rebuilding Rome. He brings in food so that people can be fed. People are happy. People are seeing a change. There's less direct civil conflict, and there's new building projects. Some of these roads that were built during the days of Augustus, which was, 2,000 years ago, are still hanging around. Giant good building projects, and even the fact that he ruled for the better part of 4 decades. He was a great ruler, setting Rome up for a time called Pax Romana. A literal translation that means Roman peace. This period of peace in the Roman Empire that lasted for 2 centuries. There were some minor problems, and some emperors who ruled during this time who were really terrible examples of humanity. Tiberius, Caligula, Nero, for just to name a few. But following them, we see the 5 good emperors. Nerva, the guy who came to power after Nero's death, elected by the Senate to rule. Trajan made the empire bigger than it ever had been. Hadrian built a wall that ran all across northern England. Antonius Pius ruled without warfare. But by far the best of them was Marcus Aurelius. They say that after Augustus, there really wasn't another great emperor like him, but I argued that Marcus Aurelius was better. He saw the empire grow to its height. He saw it get very wealthy, socially great, culturally great. He was a governor, he was a general, he was an emperor. He was a politician, a statesman, a philosopher. During his time, merchants are able to get to China and come back for the first time, and increase what the Romans even knew about the world, more than just the empire that they already had. But even during this time of great prosperity, most of Rome is still poor. Most people bathe in public baths. They live in cramped, one-room, insulare, apartment-style buildings. But they don't rebel because they've got everything they could ask for. They have free food, they have entertainment. So even though things aren't great, they're not upset enough to leave. Education in Rome was based on, if you're a boy, then and you're wealthy, you're probably going to be able to go into an academy of some kind. Wealthy girls, they could probably study at home, and realistically they learned less than their male counterparts. If you weren't wealthy, if you were a plebeian class person, you probably still knew some basic stuff. You could read, you could write, you could do basic arithmetic. You might have a functioning knowledge of specific academic individuals, but no more so than a layperson today knows. Octavian would claim power after a civil war between himself and Mark Antony, and Octavian was convinced from this point on Rome was just too big for one person to rule. It was too big for it to be ruled by anyone other than one. Around 180, at the end of Pax Romana, Rome starts to go into a period of, things start going downhill at this point. Emperor Commodus, the son of Marcus Aurelius, bankrupts the treasury. He is ultimately killed by his own troops because he had a list of enemies and people he wanted to see dead, and when that was revealed, they kill him. And following the death of Commodus, we see that Rome itself enters the 3rd century crisis, a period that lasts functionally throughout the entire 3rd century, where almost 30 different people call themselves emperor, are emperor, or are puppet emperors that are shaped and created by their armies. The problem that the army had at this point is that, it was a problem that Julius Caesar had started. If you served in the army, you were given land. And that's great, because land equals wealth, and land equals status. But where does the land come from? You have a giant army, you use that army to conquer your neighbors, so you can give that conquered land to your soldiers when they retire, which in turn means you will need a bigger army eventually to do the same thing. It is a circular problem that does not go away quickly, easily, or at all. There were a couple of attempts to fix the empire. Diocletian increased the number of people who could serve in the army, and then divided the empire in half, so that the wealth from the east could prop up the struggles in the west. Unfortunately, the west couldn't stand on its own. Constantine tried to stabilize things. He would move the capital of the Roman Empire out of Rome to a city that he named after himself, Constantinople, and late in life converted to Christianity. Doing this legitimized Christianity. At this point, Christianity was the scapegoat slash cult slash outside group that was used to justify any problem that Rome faced. It was always, you just blame the Christians. They were an easy target. But when Constantine converts, he makes it the thing to be Christian. And Christianity spreads across Rome like fire. Theodosius made the east and west entirely separate empires. Diocletian cut them in half. You can see on this map where the east and western empires would be. But cutting it in half really was the last thing that could have been done to save it. Rome had had a peculiar relationship with barbarians throughout its existence, typically speaking, paying them off, keeping them away from larger problems, larger things. And when Rome was unable to defend itself anymore, this happened at the worst possible event when the Germanic barbarians attacked. And over a period of time, these barbarians were able to take advantage of the weaknesses that had plagued Rome. Rome's armies, Rome's social components, Rome's political ineptitudes were not enough to keep it defended. And it was not just one group. Alaric led a major army against Rome itself, but the Huns, led by Attila, plundered different cities in Italy. This was an all-over problem, not just one city that was being besieged. When Rome finally fell, when the city itself was finally being sieged by the Goths and Visigoths, Huns, Republic. Sorry, Waffles just walked into the room and I want to make sure he's off the bookshelf. In 509, when this happens, the Romans establish a republic. And a republic is a type of government where you elect individuals to make the big decisions for you. It's in the family of being a democracy. However, it is faster. While the democracy, especially the Athenian model of democracy, did get everybody involved, it was glacial slow. While the republic was able to function at least a little quicker, even though it was not a total pooling of everyone.